could angels, in fact, could fallen angels be responsible for designing the species, the diversity of life we see around us? That's the provocative proposal of a book I just finished reading. And this book has to do with an attempt to reconsider or resurrect the idea of gap creationism or Ruin-Restoration Creationism or the gap theory, or there's a variety of different names for it. And so that's what I want to discuss today. I want to tell you about this interesting proposal, compare it a little bit to previous gap theories or gap creationism. All that and much more coming up. Okay, so you're like, gap creationism? I haven't heard that in a while. Or I have no idea what you're talking about. Restoration, what's this thing? This is some sort of way to reconcile science and scripture. Yeah, there's a good reason why you haven't heard it much, because it's sort of fallen out of favor in most Christian realms, right? So, but nonetheless, I could not help but read this book right here, The Creation of Species, The Role of Angels in Intelligent Design. That to me is a pretty snappy title. I have to find out what they've got to say, right? So actually, I ran across this on somebody had mentioned it or shown a picture of this book on a Facebook group that I'm on. And I think there was really no response to it and nobody had ever heard of it. But I instantly looked it up on Amazon, and I was like, this is kind of intriguing. I have to read this. And what I'm going to do is, this is just kind of a fun talk. We're going to talk about gap creationism, but I really want to talk about the nature. I also want to talk about just like, who are people that write this type of stuff? And how is it different, and what problem is it trying to solve? We'll talk about the problems it's trying to solve, but at the same time, I'm going to tell you about the many, many problems that it creates, because there's a good reason why not everyone has made this proposal, and it's not popular, and you've never heard of this particular proposal about the angels and intelligent design. And so nobody has read this book. Maybe I'm the only person to have read this book. And so you're not sticking around, I'm sure, because this is going to be an influential book that you need to know about. So this is just a fun exercise in looking at some of the, we'll say, the extreme fringe of creationism. And those who sit, I don't know where, in their parents' basement and have ideas and feel like they need to share them with the world, and they self-publish books on Amazon.com. All right, so let's dig into it. The Creation of Species. Before we dive into this, let's do a really brief recap of what gap creationism or Ruin-Restoration Creationism or gap theory entails. And to do that, all you have to do is look at Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 and ask yourselves, what does those first two verses of Genesis mean? And here we have in the English Standard Version, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and the darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, of course, it's verse 2, for which there have been hundreds of books written trying to elucidate the meaning of this second verse. And one popular way of interpreting this back in the 1800s and up really into the early 1900s, maybe up to, let's say, 1950, was to suggest that there is a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, hence the gap or gap theory. And so God creates the heavens and the earth, which is a merasmism, which means the combined words of heavens and earth is sort of meant to be totality, right, of all things, maybe physical and non-physical, the entire universe, if you want to think of it that way. And then there is verse 2 comes along, and the earth, so now it's focusing on the earth, became without form and void. Now, I'm reading a different translation there. in this figure, Genesis 1:2, the earth became without form and void. This is the way a gap theorist would read this text, or this is the way they would interpret the Hebrew language into English. Such that, okay, well, now we're focused on the earth, and the earth became formless and void, or without substance, or became a wasteland. Now, if it became a wasteland, that would suggest it was something other than a wasteland beforehand. And so some theologians have suggested that maybe there is a gap in time between the events of Genesis 1:1, simply the origin of the universe, and then this earth becoming formless and void, such that it needs, or becoming a wasteland, such that it needs to be recreated, and therefore the Ruin-Restoration Creationism part of this theory. That the original creation of Genesis 1:1 was somehow ruined, and usually that ruin portion is, the idea of ruin there comes from the fallen angels, right? Originally, angels were created good, but some fell, Lucifer in particular, taking many other angels with them, or rebelled against God, the creator, and essentially mucked up the original creation. And therefore, God had to then recreate, all right, from the ruins. He had to restore that original creation. So the earth became without form and void. And then what happens? You have the recounting of the 6 days of creation. So those are 6 days in which God then reshapes the earth into a habitable place that man can then be his ultimate creation and have a relationship with himself. All right, so that's the basic idea. There is a gap, and during that gap, a whole lot of things could have happened. And we're not given any information, since there's no verses between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 about what happened during that period of time, or how long that period of time was. Years, thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, billions of years, potentially, in which there was another creation, another world that existed prior to our world. Now, just a little bit more about this. The gap theory or gap creationism is usually attributed to, or its popularity is attributed to the promotion in writing of this idea by Scottish minister Thomas Chalmers in 1814. He says he got the idea reading Dutch theologian Episcopius, but certainly Chalmers popularized the idea. Now, you have to think about what was happening in the 1800s. You had a lot of advances in geological knowledge. You had a lot of people coming to the realization that the world just looks to be much older than just 6,000 years as one interpretation of the scriptures, right, of the 6-day creation, in which there's no gap. You're left with maybe 6,000 years of history, and yet the world looks much older than that. And so where might we find this age? Oh, well, look, there is another way to interpret the Hebrew in Genesis 1:2. So here we have Chalmers talking talking about Genesis 1:1. He says, "My own opinion, as published in 1814, is that it forms no part of the first day." Now he's talking about this gap, right? But it refers to a period of indefinite antiquity when God created the worlds out of nothing. The commencement of the first day's work I hold to be the moving of God's Spirit upon the face of the waters. We can allow geology the amplest time without infringing upon the literalities of the Mosaic record. Now, the literalities would be the 6-day creation, right? Which then leads to the 6-day work week and other things and other reasons that young earth creationists would say it's so important to read the Genesis record as being 6 literal 24-hour days. And so Chalmers and others after him promoted the gap theory as a way of preserving the literal face value, or what they would consider the face value reading of Genesis 1:1 through the end of the chapter, but also allowing for what they considered to be the obvious evidence of the world around them, which was that this world has existed for a long period of time. So how can we have both? How can we have our cake and kind of eat it too, right? And so the gap theory is like this first major attempt to accommodate scriptures and the growing evidence from science. All right, that brings us to this book. Now, Gap Creationism has been around, as I said, since the early 1800s. It became actually quite popular in the early 1900s, up till around the 1950s, when eventually it kind of gets superseded by progressive creationism, which is a form of old earth creationism. So gap theory is a form of old earth creationism, that the world was created long ago and it's very, very old, but not necessarily accommodating evolutionary biology or Darwinianism of the time. And but progressive creationism also turns its attention to thinking about, well, what's the origin of species and life on Earth? And progressive creationism is a way of saying that God intelligently designed things and progressively created things over these long periods or long ages. But instead of looking for those long ages in a gap, they saw the long ages in the actual days themselves, saying each day was a long period of time, and trying to relate that somehow to the geological ages, in which God then inserted or created different kinds of species that were adapted or designed for those particular time periods and the particular ecological conditions that they faced. And that was brought about by Bernard Ram's book, The Christian View of Science and Scripture, from 1954, in which he kind of laid out this idea of progressive creationism. I wouldn't say he's the originator of that idea, but he's certainly the popularizer of the idea, which now is, in more modern forms, would be espoused by things like Hugh Ross, Reasons to Believe, and so forth, all right, is an old earth progressive creationist group. And so that idea has almost completely taken up the space of what was gap theory or Ruin-Restoration theory. Now, I would say that there's still definitely a bunch of people who have heard of gap theory and still think that that's a popular idea. And it's also in a variety of different commentaries from the 1900s. And so some people are familiar with it. But I'll say that intellectually, among theologians, modern theologians, there really aren't any serious subscribers to the idea of gap creationism. That in itself is quite interesting because, Bernard Ram actually talks about how incredibly popular gap theory was running into the early 1900s, and how there was just, that was just like what creationism was. And so not only did progressive creationists shove it out of the way, but of course there is another movement that's coming along in the 1950s and 1960s, which is flowing out of Seventh-day creationism, which would be a small subset of Christianity, which would be young earth creationism, right? But that doesn't really rise to the level that it is today until the 1960s. And so both of those different contrasting views or interpretations of Scripture are really take hold in mid-20th century. And so gap creationism really has like 100-year reign, as the popular idea. And so, that would have just been like, well, that's just what you believe. That's what people accepted as an interpretation of scriptures. That's how we balance the ideas that are coming out of modern science with a faithful, they would consider a faithful interpretation of scripture. It just goes to show you how much can change, in 100 years. All right, so now we come to the book, all right, that we're going to discuss here. The Creation of Species, The Role of Angels in Intelligent Design by Jason North. And you ask, who is this Jason North? Why should I be listening to Jason North? What kind of, what expertise does he have? Is he a Hebrew scholar? Is he a scientist? Is he specialized in angiology or something like that? The answer is, I have no idea. All right, I bought a book from somebody I had never heard of. I did a little research on Jason North, and I came up with exactly 0 bits of information about Jason North, because such a person doesn't seem to exist. At least anybody with the name Jason North doesn't seem to have anything to do with this particular topic. There is a web page for this book. It does not mention anything about the author. The author, having read the book, I really can't say that there was any tips in the book at all about what this person does as a living, whether they have any expertise in this area. I think the book is actually fairly well written in terms of like grammar and readability, and they've obviously done some research. The backup book has, a fair number of references, and I do believe, based on what I read, that he's read a large number of these, and what they are, almost all are intelligent design, Discovery Institute type material, and young earth creationist material, and a little bit of say reasons to believe materials. And he's kind of taking, I think it's a he, an amalgam of these ideas, and then tweaking gap creationism to create his own sort of variety of his own solution, right? It's just like a lot of people are say, like, I have a problem with progressive creationism or biologos or young earth creationism, and I can find a real serious flaw, with either their science or their theology. And so everyone's looking for their own answer, right? Their own way to sort of synthesize and put these two things together and have a full-orbed understanding of how to understand God's word and the creation that we see with our eyes. And that's what he's claiming he's done. He's found a better explanation for all these things. But as you can see, this was published in 2021. It's almost a year old. It has exactly 1 rating and no reviews. All right, so I got 1 5-star rating. Maybe it's Jason North who gave himself his own rating. And no reviews. And as you might imagine, it has a sales ranking of 12 million or something like that. It's pretty low, meaning haven't sold a whole lot of copies. Must be really excited that I bought a copy, because I might be the only person that's bought a copy of this. This is his own publishing unit. It's self-published. But I'm always, I think it's kind of fun to read people who they have a real desire to try to understand this topic. And they have read maybe different materials than I have, or a different combination of materials than anyone else has read. And then they come up with their own novel ideas. And it's super easy for me to show why their novel ideas they just don't work. But it's still kind of, it did make me think of a few things I had never thought of before. And I'm definitely going to cogitate on a little bit, all right, as to, whether there's a possibility that some of these ideas might have some merit, maybe in a different way. So here's a screenshot from the website. Only one way to reconcile science in the Bible. There's only one way to reconcile real scientific evidence and a literal understanding of and faith in the Bible, and how few have found it. Well, now, how few have found it? Apparently only one person has found it thus far. Maybe the person that gave it a 5-star rating is somebody else, and maybe they are convinced as well. So let's give them 2. 2 people might have found this particular explanation out of what? Thousands of people who have spent like nearly their entire lives studying and thinking on this topic and writing on this topic. But Jason North, he's got the answer for you. So before we look at some of the details of the book, let's just go over his thesis, right? What is Jason's North thesis? And I call it Gap Creationism with a twist. He's going to add in his own little original ideas mostly about biological evolution and how that can be squeezed into the gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So let's cover the basic outline of his idea. So he has the origin of the world, or the creation of the world, right, is Genesis 1:1, right? God created the heavens and the earth. And so all the physical matter of the universe is created and the earth itself is created. But there's no life, right? So in this original creation, there's no life to begin with. God does create the angels, which apparently he doesn't think is a form of life, but is another being in this world. And God creates the angels, and we know that angels are created beings from the scriptures. And so they're part of the creation of the world itself. They're not eternal. And so what are the angels assigned to do, though? I mean, well, what's their job, in this universe? Well, according to Jason North, God assigns or puts the angels on this world, the earth, and gives them the task of ordering and filling it, all right, with wonderful forms of life. Possibly even including up to human-like life, but not human beings themselves. And so this is kind of similar to the assigned role for Adam and Eve in the garden, right? God is preparing this garden or a particular place on earth, places Adam in it, and then gives him tasks and roles. And one of the tasks is, is to multiply and fill the world, but also to name the animals, to give function to the things that are in this world, to order it, to organize the world, right? Bring it under subjugation. All right. And when I say that word, I just mean that to bring it into a sense of order versus being wild and uncaptivated or uncultivated, to cultivate the world. And so in a large sense, North is saying this is the original responsibility of the angels. And so we're going to see that the angels fail at that job. And that's why Adam and Eve are sort of, number two, right? That's trial number two, or attempt number two. So you've got the angels assigned this task of making life forms. Now, but there's a problem. God has to create the first cell because Jason North believes the first cell is too complicated. It's irreducibly complex. The angels are not God, right? The angels have some limited capacity, more capacity than we have, the more knowledge than we have, but nonetheless, not the knowledge that God has. Only God could create the first life form, and that life form has the capacity to be adapted into other living things, right? It has a genome and a basic set of instructions on how life works. And then the angels are given this job of figuring out how to adapt that original life into other life forms, all right? To create the life that's, the diversity of life that's on this earth. All right, so great. Angels are going to then, over time, and potentially hundreds of millions of years, dink around with this original life form, gradually changing its DNA and trying out new options and gradually figuring out how to make all kinds of new properties for these living things and creating a community, an ecology in which different forms of this life have to interact with each other and so forth. And of course, they should all do this in some sort of perfect union, a very good sense of how they're interacting with each other, not killing each other, not, having, not taking advantage of one another and so forth. But there's a problem. All right. One of the angels rejects this plan that God has for how he's going to create the diversity and fill this world, maybe potentially even fill the universe, all right, with wonderful forms of life that would then be, I guess you could say glorifying God, through their angels' creative capacity, they're glorifying God, just like Adam and Eve are to produce things in this world and a structure in their world as they fill and multiply and name the animals that should glorify God as well. There's a problem, right? Lucifer rejects God's plan. So one of the angels rejects the plan and takes down a bunch of other angels with him, all right? Convinces other angels too, we're not following that plan. And therefore, the plan gets corrupted, all right? And since the plan is corrupted, that then starts to produce imperfect life forms, all right? Because they're producing, at that time, only things that were beneficial, only things that worked well with each other, only things that had perfect design. All right. And this goes back to the title of the book, right? The role of angels in intelligent design. They're intelligent beings and they're intelligently designing things. But and here's what I found really fascinating about I found a lot of things fascinating in there as well. But Jason North talks about, he's obviously a huge intelligent design advocate, but he recognizes that lots of organisms are not designed to the best of their ability. They have flaws, right? There's a lot of flaws in the design. And God is a perfect God, and he can't make imperfect design. So how do you explain imperfect design? Now, most people will go right to what young earth creationists do, which is they'll say, the world was perfect in the beginning, and there was no imperfect design. Everything was absolutely perfect in terms of its interactions and how it worked. There was no flaws. And then Adam sinned, that brought corruption into the world, and then everything's falling apart. So like this genetic entropy thing where DNA is being corrupted, and therefore parts of organisms don't work to the best of their capacity. We look at it and go, like, that's not perfect design. But he's going to say, I look at this and I see imperfect design all around, and I agree with those who say that this is part of the way the world works. There's imperfect design. Not everything looks perfectly designed. And it's not just that it fell apart. It's that it was imperfectly designed to begin with. So that's one of the twists here. He's going to say that angels that are fallen don't have the right mindset when they're creating new species, such that they're not making perfectly adapted species for this world, but they're either fighting with each other, or they're just lazy, or they're intentionally designing things just to be like mess things up, right? They are intentionally rejecting God's plan to have a perfect world. And they're introducing these corruptions into different life forms such that they don't really work perfectly well. They work well enough to survive, but they're not perfectly adapted to this world. And so imperfect design is the result of the imperfections in the angels designing the life we have. All right. So after millions of years, hundreds of millions of years potentially of Lucifer and his angels running amok and not designing as well as they could, they've created an entire world filled with imperfect designed organisms. And of course, what goes along with that is death, animals that are eating other animals, which even he would think is not part of the original plan of God, but that's what happened. At some point, God has to step in and say, enough is enough. This has gone too far off the rails. I'm going to start over. All right. Hence the Ruin-Restoration. Right. Getting to like, now we're going to learn about Genesis 1:2. God says, that's enough. We're stopping here. Kind of like with the flood later on, right? Every intent of man was evil. And when it got so bad, God said, the only thing I can do here is, or the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe out man across the face of the earth. And I'm going to start over with a smaller group and give, there's going to be another chance to begin again. That's for Jason North, that's like the third try. All right. So God finally decides to start over, and he wipes out the face of the earth. All right. So he literally destroys the face of the earth, killing off all living things again. And then the stage is set. All right. God can now spend 24 literal hour days restoring the surface of the earth and all the life forms on it. Now here's where it gets a little wonky. Well, I'm sorry. There was already a lot of wonky parts, but here's where, to me, it gets really crazy. He's going to use all the things that those angels made in terms of the life that was already made. He wiped it all out, but he's going to use all those same designs and then recreate him himself. And so they're not perfect. That explains why we look around us and the designs of organisms are not perfect today. He didn't start over and just like, okay, now I'm going to make perfect stuff. He's like, I used the angels as an instrument to create this world. I'm going to honor their attempt because some of it was good and some of it was well-meaning. Just like today, he's using people who are fallen to still do good in this world. And I'm trying to get into the mindset of Jason North in his rationale for why we don't see a disconnect between, hey, there's this a billion years worth of history, which now is in the fossil record and all that, because, during this entire time of the angels creating, all this history happened and it's preserved for us and we see it. See, this is how he's going to combine science and scripture and try to have a literal interpretation of Genesis, along with still accepting essentially almost all of what conventional geology and biology says. And so he says, oh, look, all right, there's no boundary or marker that you can see between the old animals that all the angels created and the new world that God created, because he simply just recreated the exact same thing and took all their designs and remade them. And at the same time, though, he's planting this garden and creating Eden, and specifically the Garden of Eden. And maybe in the Garden of Eden, there was like the best forms. And I'm going beyond his book here because he doesn't actually talk about this. He really should have talked more about how this would happen. So I'm gonna add to him. I'm gonna continue to, let's say, develop his ideas. Okay, so there's this Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden is described as differently from the rest of the world, which is still not ordered. It's still a wasteland. Right? There's animals and plants out there, but they're not under the right kind of. They haven't been organized. They haven't been cultivated, right? But in the garden, it's a cultivated space. And so maybe the plants and animals there are more like what God intended originally and hoped that the angels had come up with. But of course, Adam is placed in that place. But Adam's body itself is also a carbon copy of a body plan that was part of the proto-man that the angels came up with. So the angels had over a billion years had been able to manipulate that original cell into this advanced life form that was very human-like. So that's the pre-Adamites. And so gap theory allows for pre-Adamites, right? Gap theory allows for there to have been human-like animals during this gap. So even like Neanderthals and other things, anything from the fossil record, you could be said those aren't really humans because they're not descendants of Adam and Eve. But it's not denying that they didn't exist. They just existed in this gap period, and they were all destroyed. All right, by the time just before Genesis 1-2, the events of Genesis 1-2. So now you have the garden, and you have Adam and Eve there. But Adam and Eve are still like physically based on the design that these angels came up with. But the angels were corrupted, and therefore even the human design is not perfect in a way. And then God does give the Adam and Eve, all right, this opportunity to follow his word, because he gives them instructions, right? He gives them some basic laws about what they are to do. They're not to eat of that tree. All right, they can eat of this tree. And they fail, of course. And one of the reasons, and Jason North doesn't say this, but this is where I'm developing his idea for him. One of the reasons potentially is that their bodies have actually been developed based on what you could call a pseudo-evolutionary mechanism, right? The angels are doing this process. They're intelligently designing, but it actually mimics very much the process of evolutionary biology. They're making stabs and attempts at like, I'm mutating these different bases because I want to make this new feature. Oh, that didn't really work. I'm going to try out a whole bunch of different variants and I'm going to see what I can get out of that, right? It's sort of like they're tinkering around all the time, just doing massive genetic engineering. But they're not great at it because they don't have perfect knowledge, right? They're having to make attempts and then see how the attempts turn out and then try again. And so Adam and Eve's bodies, physical bodies, right? Not their spiritual, their souls, which God would have created separately, and you could say were different than anything else that any of the angels could have done. But their bodies are based on a world that was created by faulty engineering, and part of that faulty engineering is in order to survive in the previous world, those bodies would have needed to do things like be selfish for resources, which means like, I might kill, another individual in my population, or I might try to steal from them, or I might do, because these are all properties that Lucifer's body construction factory would have created inclinations in our physical bodies toward what we now call sinful activities. And so Adam and Eve might have been first created, and they hadn't sinned, but they had bodies that were susceptible to sinning, and sure enough, they sinned. And hence the need for eventually Christ, who God sends and can't be corrupted by Lucifer and his minions, and therefore offers an opportunity for true salvation and becoming what God originally intended for man all along. Okay, that was a whole lot, right? So let me, what I'm going to do now is we're just going to step through, some quotes from his book, so I can talk about some of these angles just with a few more details. Now, before I do that, I just remembered I want to read you what's on the back cover of his book. What both sides miss. What both sides miss, and here he's talking about, because his first two chapters are really about evolutionary biology, and he talks about young Earth creationism. And he's going to say, here's what's right about evolutionary biology, and here's what's wrong about evolutionary biology. Here's what's good about young Earth creationism, but here's where they get it wrong, right? And so both of them have something wrong, and I'm going to find some way for them both to be right, in a sense, right? My idea will bridge the gap. So what's wrong here? He says, the evidence both in nature and the Bible shows design. All right. But design by limited and imperfect intelligence. So he's recognizing, as I said before, that the world has an indelible mark of intelligence in terms of the elements that are in it look designed. But you can always find flaws in those designs, right? And so he's going to explain this as being a designer, but a designer with limited intelligence. Since God is perfect and doesn't have limited intelligence, God didn't actually design the organisms on Earth. They were designed by something else. And that something else isn't natural selection, genetic drift, and mutations, but it's this semi-intelligent life, the angels. So this new book suggests that God used angels as his servants and designed the species of life, and that God allowed the angels to use common descent over millions of years to do the job at a pace they could handle with their limited abilities. Okay, so he says in the chapter about evolution that evolution's right about two things. There is abundant evidence of common origin or common descent, right? That species look like they have a common ancestor. All right, so he has examples of common ancestry. It's like, this is undeniable. There's common ancestry, not just within a kind or something like that young Earth creationists say, but like all life appears to have a common design. It all can be traced back to a single cell. And so, at first you're like, that's full-blown evolutionary biology, right? Common design. But he's saying that they still couldn't take those steps without the designer. And so what does the designer do? Well, the designer is dinking around with common descent and mutations and simply guiding that process. So this is intelligent design evolution, or some might call it, you could even call that theistic evolution, saying that it's all guided, even though it appears to be just by forces that don't require designer. Creation of species supports this with evidence from science and the Bible. It shows proof that God exists and explains why God has allowed cruelty in nature and suffering and injustice in man's society. It shows why neither evolution nor sudden creation directed by God can be true. Okay, so, hey, evolutionary biology as a methodological, materialism, or as defined by most evangelicals. And sudden instant creation all right, by God directly designing. Both of those are not right. So this is the only explanation that fits both the science, the Bible, and the scientific evidence. So he's done enough reading of the scientific evidence to be convinced that young Earth creationism can't have it right. The Earth must be old. And evolution, in terms of common descent of all living things, must be true as well. This book can provide answers to those with an open mind who are searching for the truth. And it challenges those who are firmly entrenched in either evolution or sudden creation views. It's like, great. All right, now convince me. I'm interested in learning some new ideas, and I'm willing to be challenged, I think. Unfortunately, there's so many flaws in his ideas, both scientific and theological, which is what's kind of sad, is because he thinks he has a clear view of both, and yet I think he has an incorrect view of both things. This book should be in the library of anyone serious about researching the creation and evolutionary controversy. It is unique. I grant him that. This book is unique, and there's no other explanation like it. Well, yes, you can say that about your own book. You're absolutely right. Should it be in the library of anyone serious about researching this? No, probably not. And that's not going to happen. It's not catching on. It's not wildfire. I'm giving it more publicity than I'm sure this book has ever received, since I've searched and searched and searched for anyone who has anything to say about this book, and I have found nothing. And I have to admit, that makes me just a little bit sad for Jason North, or whoever it is, because I'm pretty sure this is a pseudonym. Because here he devoted an enormous amount of time to writing this out, and I'm sure he hoped that somebody would read it and be like inspired by it. And although I'm talking about it, I'm not inspired by it. I'm sorry, Jason. I found it a fun read, and I found it fascinating from here's somebody looking at the world, and they're identifying problems that I see in young Earth creationism. And they're identifying some things that I see among some evolutionary biologists, right? But the way he connects it together shows me he neither has a deep understanding of scriptures nor a deep understanding of the science, and he's very much influenced by the intelligent design literature. And unfortunately, that's really has drawn him away from being able to inspect this very well. So I don't think this is going to end up in the library of many people. I might be the only person who will have this in their library. All right, and then he says, look at the table of contents to show you the range of topics and arguments covered. Like, I can explain hundreds of things, all right? And I've done all this research, and I've read all these books, because look, there's 70 references at the end. Yeah, so I'm not going to show you all the different chapters, but I'll just, because the first couple chapters are really just about laying out, like, here's what evolutionary biologists say, here's what young Earth creationists say, and then pointing out some flaws in both of those to build his, like, hey, I'm going to have a better explanation that will explain all these problems. And I will say that he does come up with things that explain problems that, like, specifically young Earth creationists have. But in the process, he creates like a dozen problems for every one problem he solves. Eventually, we're going to talk about this, the advantages of guided modification and branching, GMB. That's the name for his theory, by the way. The GMB. Yeah, I can't remember what I was going to say about that. Oh, and then at the very end, he's got this hodgepodge of topics where it's sort of like, okay, I don't really know how this fits in with my book, but I want to say something about, like, what we're being taught in schools, and I want to say something about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and what you should really be thinking about science, and how we're all being manipulated by the government. And it's like okay, I've got like a whole bunch of other semi-conspiracy theories. They don't really have directly anything to do with the gap theory and my particular proposal for how angels designed all the diversity of life. But I'm never going to have another chance to say this again, so I'll just throw it in the back of my book. All right, so that's what we have at the end. I have to admit, I didn't read that part very thoroughly. All right, I was mostly interested in the gap theory part. Okay, so all I've got left here is just quotes from the book to give me a chance to say a few other things about this and compare it. How does this help me inform? How did this get me to think about some other things? All right. First, I want to show you is how he's influenced by intelligent design. I'm sorry, just realized I had my image in the wrong spot. Okay, so all I've got left is I just want to go through some quotes from the book. Give me some opportunity to talk a little bit more in depth about some of his ideas, and then contrast and compare that with other, I'll say, current models of how to bridge the gap between science and scripture. And so, first of all, we have, I want to show you that he's influenced by intelligent design literature. So here's a quote, first quote: intelligent design to modify DNA to produce new species from parent species, combined with the emergence of species through common descent over millions of years, can explain all of the physical evidence science has found. And so you see, he's suggesting that, yes, you can start out with, you can have DNA, and you can have a species, and species can be modified by intelligent design, an intelligent designer, right, in order to use that design to make additional species from that. The truth is, for those who are willing to look at the evidence objectively, there is evidence of intelligent design, but limited, imperfect design, not sudden, perfect design done directly by an infinite God. I actually think he has an interesting point here. Intelligent designists generally believe that the earth is very old and that there's an intelligent designer and that God has been designing life up through the present and sort of, I'll say, dinking around with the patterns and of life, and then rearranging or adding new parts, right, to create new species. So some intelligent designers are like, every species is newly created in the sense that it's been injected with a new piece of design, a new modification of the DNA. And others will be a little more, major things that happen in the history of life are intelligently designed. And then they kind of have the ability to sort of undergo some natural variation and recombination to make, I'll call them spin-off designs from that, but not directly from the designer itself in terms of immediate fiat design. And what North is doing here is he's saying, look, you can look at any organism and a new species, and maybe you looked in history and you see a species, and if you looked hard enough, you'd find out that not every single thing about that organism is like as well designed for its environment as it could be. And most organisms have parts of bad design, right? They have elements in their genomes that are leftover elements from previous designs that weren't taken out, or things that are still trying to be made but aren't exactly completely made, right? You have pseudogenes, right? And they're not actually producing anything, but they're taking up space, which requires some energy in order to replicate them. Right? And a completely perfect intelligent designer wouldn't leave these elements behind in their further creative evolution, and they would make everything be perfectly adapted to their environment, not just kind of good enough adapted to their environment. And so he's recognizing that the history of life is the history of good design, but not perfect design. And so I think this is an interesting observation. And again, as I said before, I think earlier on, the young Earth creationist has a response to this because they're going to say that everything was perfect and there was a exact perfect design in the original created kinds, and that perfection is degrading, and that's why we see imperfect design. So they'll freely admit that as you look at organisms, they're not perfect, right? They have mistakes in them. Right? They have things that aren't as efficient as they could be. But their explanation is Adam sinned, and that sin then corrupted all of life, and so everything is falling apart. And that's the reason it looks in design. But if you're going to say the world is old and organisms have existed for millions of years, and you look back in the fossil record, you can't use Adam and Eve as an excuse for bad design 1 billion years ago. And so therefore, not seeing perfect design in the past means it's always been imperfect. How is it imperfect? That can't be an intelligent designer as great as God himself, and therefore it must be from something else. And for him, that's the angels, because the angels had limited knowledge and they're trying to do their best. It's just that they're not going to be perfect, right? They're making good enough. They're not making perfect. Just another example of the influence of intelligent design on this author. Bees and other pollinating insects need flowering plants to obtain their food from pollen, but flowering plants need pollinator insects to reproduce. How could they evolve together? Only through random mutation and natural selection. This is in a section where he's talking about evolution is right. There is common design, right? Or there's common descent, and there is modification of that. So he says there's two things that evolutionary theory has right. There is descent by modification, right? And there's descent from common ancestors. But then he completely takes up the intelligent design literature and says that these are designs that couldn't have happened by regular processes like natural selection and mutation. And therefore, there has to be a designer, even if that designer is not a perfect designer. And so here here's like a typical example, right? There is insects that would pollinate a flower, would have no reproductive advantage for doing so if the flowers didn't exist. So which came first? It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. This shows me right here, he doesn't have a deep knowledge of, I'll say, evolutionary biology and just regular biological literature and paleontological literature to know about the history of pollinating insects. And they're not connected in the fossil record exactly with those pollinators. Pollinators have switched, their mechanisms of what they gather as a resource over time. Yeah, I don't want to get sorry. I don't want to go on 20 minutes about that. I'll just say that this is not an example of proof that there is a designer that had to have made this particular system, because it's not that hard to explain, right? From a natural selection perspective. Okay, so that was just to illustrate that he's dealing with evolutionary biology. He's kind of like accepting a large component of evolutionary biology, but saying there's this one part I don't accept, and it's really a design basis, all right? But it's over long billions of years, and it was through common ancestry and descent with modification, but the modifications are being done by angels. All right, then he turns to a chapter in which he talks about creationism, all right? And he kind of gets into things like the flood as like, hey, young earth creationists have this right. The Bible is correct in all the details in terms of literally reading those first chapters of Genesis. There's an ark, and it must have had all the different representatives of animals on it. So here he's talking about, well, but how did Noah keep all those animals on the ark? But solutions are possible for those who look for them. He's read a bunch of young earth creationist literature, and he finds it perfectly compatible with what he thinks the world's evidence is. But I found this particular example kind of funny, so that's the reason I use this quote. Female animals on the ark could have come aboard already pregnant from a different male that accompanied them, adding to the genetic diversity of species. So he's actually talking about how one of the problems that people brought up is like, where did all the genetic diversity come from in organisms alive today if they went through this bottleneck in the ark? And he's like, I can solve that problem. And he's not getting this from the young earth creationist literature. I think this is his own idea. All right, that female animals come, there's a male and a female, right, that are brought to the ark. And those two animals would only have a certain amount of total genetic information in them. But if the female were pregnant, right, from a different male, then she would potentially have a bunch of other variants in those offspring, which then would, maybe double the amount of total variation available to post-flood speciation events. One little tiny problem with this. I don't see young earth creationists proposing this. Sometimes they'll propose that they got pregnant while on the ark, and so that's how they started to have offspring so quickly after the ark. But most young earth creationists believe that life begins at conception, right? And if that's true, a pregnant female coming to the ark would already have multiple offspring inside of her. And so the Bible would be incorrect by saying there was only 2 of each kind, because there wouldn't be 2 of each kind. There would be 10 or 15 or 50, right, of a kind actually coming to the ark, because you'd have to count all those different embryos that are inside of that female. So I think that's one of the reasons that reason is not been offered up by young earth creationists. But I don't think this author thought too much about that and just simply threw this out there. And there's a lot of that in this book. All right, there's a lot of the just sort of like, oh, when I saw that, well, that could have happened or that could have happened, without really thinking of the biology or the theological implications of it. Okay, let's give this thing a name. So he gets down to chapter 6. And he's like, okay, so we've got all these ideas together. Now I want to give my idea a name so that it's catchy and all of us were talking about it. And now that I'm making this video and my throngs of subscribers who may or may not still be listening to me at this point say to themselves, this is an awesome idea. I'm going to start promoting GMB. All right, guided modification and branching. All right, okay. So guided modification, it's guided by angels. They're doing modifying, and you're branching, which means you're speciating. Right, they're creating variants that eventually create species, and this is how the world is populated with genetic diversity and the vast diversity of life on Earth. Or if you don't like that name, he's okay with you calling it design modification and branching, incremental design through common descent, intelligent design through common descent, intelligent design modification, or descent with design modification. So I guess he's trying to copyright all those different ideas here in this paragraph. So it's defining feature as the deliberate and intelligent design of the DNA code that makes up each species through the work of angels under God's authority and supervision, not all at once and not with each species designed individually from scratch, but over a long period of time with the DNA code from the parent life form modified to produce each new life form. There it is in a nutshell. All right, there it is. It's basically a form of theistic evolution, but crammed into the gap. And then you have the world is ruined, and where God sort of wipes that all out, but then replaces all those organisms with the same ones, such that all of our molecular phylogenies and all our paleontology still makes sense because we don't see the destruction for some reason. But you can, in his point of view, you can still have 6 24-hour days. You can still have God creating man and Adam and Eve as unique and special, even if built on the form of a previous pre-Adamite. And you also somehow also can have Noah in a worldwide flood. But that to me is like the hardest part to fit into this. All right, so let's read a couple other passages to flesh this out a little bit. Then God made the first life form. So let's go back to the beginning of life. A simple cell, perhaps a simple form of algae, which actually is algae is sometimes a multicellular organism, but let's say a unicellular alga, but that's a eukaryote, which is a really complex cell. So maybe he created a complex cell like that first rather than bacteria. That first cell would contain DNA, which God would have designed, and the protein needed to produce that DNA, right? So it could reiterate it or replicate itself. It would probably be much simpler than the life form or cell in existence today. Well, then why did he say it was as simple as an alga? Because an alga is a very complex cell compared to a bacteria. But then he turns around and says it's probably much simpler than any life form or cell in existence today. Like maybe started with something even simpler than we can imagine, even the more basic than the most basic cell we've ever found. But then through modification by angels became the cells we see today. It would contain in its structures all the necessary parts to be a successful life form and a model of more complex life forms to come. Then God instructed Lucifer, who at the time was a good angel, who was given like basically you're in charge of all the other angels, right? And the angels in how DNA and the physical life worked. basically given a guide, a guided lecture on like, here's how this thing works that I just made, and here are some possible modifications. Here's the book for genetic, how to do genetic modification, right? Here's how to manipulate DNA. Then go after it. See what you can make, right? See how you can glorify me ultimately as the creator by making things yourselves. It is what man is called to do too, is to be creative, like God is creative, but in proper ways. He gave them the knowledge and the power to work with life, to understand the DNA code, how to apply it, how to modify it to produce new species. And God probably showed them the possibilities. I don't know, like future snapshots of like, hey, I would like to see a hummingbird. That would be awesome if you could make this, right? To aspire to make these types of things out of what I've given you. Now go see what you can come up with. That would be accomplished not only with single-celled organisms, but what could be done with cells when they're combined into larger, more complex organisms, right? You could take those cells, you could like make a bunch of single-celled stuff, but you could also like put cells together and then like build things out of those. Like basically God says like, here's a big Lego set and I want to see how complex you can make your designs. So they're developing and creating the design of all the species through and by the angels of the earth. And this is the basic principle of God's delegating his creative capacities to those underneath him. And even with the work of angels, God probably didn't create the first one-cell life form of DNA and proteins. I'm sorry. Let me skip this. This is actually the same idea. I forgot I had that in there. God gave them the job to produce all variety of life for beauty, to beautify and complete the making of the earth with beautiful plants and animals. And the nature of the animal world God intended would be non-competitive, all right? Because he like young earth creationists would see like the perfect world. And, he would point to the future is supposed to be the lamb lying down with the lion and so forth. And like the ecology that is supposed to be is set aside for the future is also the way that the very beginning was. And so it was perfect. I mean, originally the angels were supposed to work under these parameters. It would be non-competitive. Plants would provide food for animals. The animals would eat all the vegetation. Animals would not hurt or kill other animals. There would be given an instant or biological limitations to control their own reproductive rate. So there wouldn't be any necessary need for predators to limit populations and so forth. Now, obviously, there would have to be death, right? And this is something young earth creationists are greatly going to, object to, is that there has to be death in this whole process. But he's trying to make the death seem as nice as possible in this world. All of this could have been started before Lucifer sinned and began to lead the angels under his supervision to sin. All right, so saying maybe there was millions of years of doing this the right way and making a wonderful world in which the designs are imperfect, right? But they're good. They're very good. They do really well. And they are following this idea of non-competitiveness, and they're working to make things that aren't competing with each other and so forth. But then Lucifer falls and then falls off the bandwagon and gets his own idea about, hey, I could modify these designs to do other things too, right? The original capacity for this modification is to make things that also can kill in other ways and be selfish and all these behaviors that would not be considered very good or godlike. So it was the sin and rebellion of Lucifer who became Satan and his angels who became demons that resulted in the destruction of the surface of the earth, causing it to be in darkness and covered with water. So he talks about how long would this have taken? Well, it could be God gave them millions of years in which they were, doing wrong. But God's a patient God, and, he has a bunch of verses to show that. But at some point, it just reaches the level of complete corruption. And God has to wipe everything out. And so he basically scorches the face of the earth and kills all the life on the earth and it becomes a desolate place again. And that's the state of chaos and confusion that you come into with Genesis 1-2. So just as the sin and violence of the human race later resulted in the destruction of the surface of the earth by the flood, see, right? What happened to the surface of the earth when all men became, their thoughts were always evil, right? That's the way it's talked about in the days of Noah. And God comes in and has to essentially erase the surface of the earth, and all life forms, all living things of land-breathing animals have to be removed, including man. And so this is the same thing that happened before Genesis 1-2. How did this destruction come about? Well, the Bible doesn't say, but he's right about that. It would have come from God as punishment for the wickedness of Satan and demons, just as God punished mankind for the sickness of the wickedness with the flood in the days of Noah. Or maybe it had been Satan's act to destroy God's creation, which God allowed Satan to do, right? Allowed him to continue in his wicked ways to the point where he just destroys himself and his environment, really, like I guess you say, like man is destroying the environment today, right? And God may be allowing that to happen potentially. Did this destruction come immediately or soon after Lucifer began to sin? No, probably not. God did not immediately destroy mankind in the flood. It's true, right? He allowed man to sin for quite a long time before finally causing that. The wickedness and violence of man built up and continued for a while before God finally destroyed mankind in a flood. So it might have taken a while for Satan to corrupt 1/3 of the angels as well, right? It might have started small, right? Satan, maybe there's millions of species, and each angel is assigned to certain groups of organisms, and they're the ones that are designing, right? And Lucifer is, even though he's in charge, he can't just like get everyone to make corrupt organisms right away. And so he's gradually corrupting the world by corrupting other angels, which then eventually results in the corruption of the types of organisms that are produced. So this is a process that might have played out over enormous amounts of time. All right. So then he finally gets to kind of his eschatology, right? End time stuff. Right? He says the Bible says that there's a 7,000-year plan. All right, for mankind. The weekly cycle of work days follows the Sabbath day. All right. Don't forget the Lord, 1,000 years is as a day. And so the 1,000 years, 6 days, that's 6,000 years. We're really close to the very end right now. And so he kind of has at the end this sort of eschatological view of like, okay, the world is contained within 7,000 years. So Christ is going to come soon. Okay. All of that said, what else can I say about this book? Let's talk about some of the problems. What do I think are some of the insurmountable problems, if you haven't already seen them? Why hasn't this caught on? Why have not more than 2 people maybe have read this book? Why isn't it in the libraries of all thinking people? There's a reason why Gap Creationism or Ruin-Restoration has fallen by the wayside. One of those is most theologians and those who study the Hebrew language think that the interpretation of fitting this gap in is really not very faithful to the text. That to say that or that there became, or here's what the world's condition is now, as if there was a gap, is not a good translation of Genesis 1-2. But also, if you just think about this for a second, it doesn't really help you. It doesn't really help anybody. It doesn't help you if you're like, okay, I want to, because the original idea was like, hey, the world looks like it's really old. How are we going to fit this in? But we still want to keep like this mosaic understanding of the 6 days. It feels like it might help with that. But when you sit down and you start thinking about it, you're like, wait a second. All right. Now, the world existed for millions of years. Fossils were made over millions of years. And then God wiped out all living things on the face of the earth. Why don't we see that moment in time? Why isn't it recorded? Because we don't really see in the fossil record, like, the fossils building up on different continents, these different organisms. all of a sudden there's some event where everything is wiped out. Like, wouldn't that have caused some kind of physical manifestation in the rock record itself? Like, we'd see a visible evidence of this destructive event. But even if you were to say, if God just snapped his fingers, like everything died, and then he's going to go through the 6 days. Now, when he goes through the 6 days in this book and he talks about what happened, he talks about, well, there was a great fog and then it blew away, and then he created the mountains and he blah, blah, blah. He goes on and talks about like all these traumatic events that happened during these 6 days, kind of like young earth creationists do, because he also follows the young earth creationist literature. And we're like, wait a second. Like, so you want to say that the entire geological column is real and exists because of millions of years of angels developing species over time, and then the rock record is happening during those millions of years. But then there's also 6 days of creation in which the world is kind of reconfigured and then all repopulated with organisms, like somehow in the exact same places that they're found in the fossil record right below where they live. And somehow new mountains and worlds are resculpted, but we can't really, like, no one's found that evidence of like some major transition zone where there's like a point where, boom, all of a sudden you have this change just 6,000 years ago. This is completely missing. But it gets worse when you start thinking about the flood, because he talks about the flood. He talks about flood. But he doesn't really talk about flood geology. He just talks about how all organisms were wiped away. And he acts like it's the same thing that happened in the original during the gap, or at the end of the gap. But wait a second. Young earth creationists think that the entire geological column, or most of it, comes from the flood itself. I mean, if the water covered the entire earth, you would think it would erode stuff. But for him, like, the Mediterranean Sea had to have been there already for millions of years. The land of Canaan, the Dead Sea, all these different locations must have existed for millions of years. In fact, there are even fossil hominids there that are pre-Adamites that are in locations that are what young earth creationists that are considered to be post-flood, because they're in caves and things like that must have been formed after the flood. But in his idea, if he thinks for 25 minutes about this, and again, others have thought for 25 minutes about this, which is why these theories don't exist anymore, or at least aren't popular anymore. If pre-Adamites, as part of the fossil record, are part of the gap, and then God recreated the world, and then there was a global flood later on, just 4,000 years ago, how did a global flood happen and not leave any trace behind? Because that's what's going to be necessary to ascribe to this view. You see what I'm saying about he's trying to solve some problems and come up with a unique solution that will make sort of evolutionary biologists and sort of young earth creationists happy, but at the same time makes both of them completely unhappy, all right? Because it completely dismisses other pieces of evidence and doesn't consider, in other words, it doesn't incorporate them. He talks about Noah's flood as if it's a real catastrophic global event and all the animals were preserved on there. And yet that only happened 4,000 years ago in the very recent fossil records. He's accepting all the geological dates and stuff like that. And yet the animals are distributed in a way that doesn't seem to show discontinuity 4,000 years ago. And, oh yeah, I'm remembering now. He basically appeals to miracle for most of this stuff. It's like, well, it was a miracle that the animals were brought to the ark, so maybe it was a miracle that they were just placed back where they originally were before the flood. And so I'm thinking maybe he's going to say that maybe it's just a miracle. Water covered the earth, destroyed the animals. They didn't really get preserved, and it didn't really reshape the surface of the earth. But I don't know how you fill up the world with water and not sort of like put a huge layer of sediment into the bottom of the Dead Sea. Because there's like a continuous column of salt there. And if the world were covered with water and it's flowing around, you're going to get some sediment that's going to settle out in the Dead Sea because it's a very low-lying area, right? So how do you have no sediment deposited there in a global flood? There's a whole bunch of issues. I am fascinated by the idea of I think it is interesting, and I think very few people spend a lot of time thinking about the origins of Satan and the effects of Satan on the world. And so what he's doing is he's providing a rationale for the existence of angels and what they did. But it's completely speculative, right? Completely speculative. Are there others that are still talking about this, about gap theory? I haven't done extensive work on it. I, of course, follow young earth creationism. Yes, I just realized that I got out of my PowerPoint presentation. And so what you're seeing is not what I intended you to see, but I'm doing this for fun, and this topic is definitely not worth repeating. I'm not going to go back and re-record this part. This was kind of just a fun exercise in looking at a book that no one else is going to read and just see what somebody's ideas are. You might ask, like, why does somebody do this? This is obviously a pseudonym or pen name. I think it's just somebody who has, it may be somebody in the intelligent design community or on the periphery of some group. It might be a known name. This might be a known individual in the world of young earth creationism or intelligent design who doesn't quite fit in. And these ideas have been percolating in their head, like, here's another potential way. This is my wild hypothesis. But I don't want to sort of like, put my name to it directly. I want to float this idea out there and just see if anybody else thinks it's a good idea. And so that's what I think sometimes these books are, is sort of like, okay, I get this wild, crazy idea. I got to get this out of my head. And so they write this book, they put it out there, and hey, if hundreds of people suddenly think that this is a great idea and people start talking about the GMB, or right, the guided modification and branching idea, then all of a sudden you might hear somebody start taking credit for it. You'd be like, oh, that was actually your idea. Doesn't look like this one's going to take off. And Jason, if you're out there, and I suspect you will come by my video, because if you are searching for anybody who says anything about this, and I put this in the title of my YouTube search, I'm going to be right there on the top. I'm sure I'm going to get hundreds of thousands of hits on this video. Not. But, certainly the one person that's interested in this video is going to find it. And to you, I say, I really did have a fun time reading this book. There's a lot of head scratching moments in there and things that I disagree with, but I found the train of thought to be fascinating. And I thought the whole idea of having identifying the problems with intelligent design, a core problem I think that is wrong with intelligent design, and identifying a flaw there is valuable. And that you're finding I think a novel solution to that problem of intelligent design by ascribing it to either angels without perfect design ability, or fallen angels, even worse, that are intentionally corrupting things. But of course, they're doing it as an intelligent agent. And so therefore, anything they produce is of intelligence. And so that's an interesting twist on that. And it's interesting to think about the role of angels, not only in the past, but in the present. But in terms of the gap theory, I really give no merit to it from a hermeneutical standpoint in terms of the interpretation of the text. I don't find any room to place a gap there, as much as sometimes I wish there was, because in some ways it does simplify some of the hard questions about the observed world around us and how to interpret Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. But I'm not looking for an easy escape route. I'm simply not going to accept it just to make an escape route for myself to solve hard problems. So great. Thanks for writing the book. And I don't know how much royalties you get, but I mean, hopefully you at least earned $1 or $2 from me, buying this off of Amazon. And if I have time, maybe I'll write a review. Not sure how many stars I'll give you. Depends on what I think the value of the book is with respect to just stimulating me to think about these things. So maybe in a generous mood, I might be a 4-star review. We'll see. Yeah, I'm running out of things to say about this book. I hope if you're still watching, I hope you found something about this intriguing. And you had kind of fun, looking at a off-the-wall creationist book, The Creation of Species, The Role of Angels in Intelligent Design. Thanks. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.